anything awarded to you that's named after Edward R. Murrow is pretty big deal. And speaking of podcasts, I really think that you guys need to, I was listening to the Breaking Blind podcast earlier today, and I was saying that David Neefeld was the star, but really we all know it's Logan. He's there with you. You could hear him. You could hear him kind of playing with his dad. As it's just a wonderful, laid-back way to share how to start being a traveler. So if you know anyone in that sort of wants to review or wants to start over or in the very beginning stages, it truly is a nice piece. And so I just wanted to promote that a little bit. Check it out. I was watching it on Spotify, but I know it's on other places as well. What else did I have? I think that's all I had for today, guys. Welcome. Yes.
All right. So we are going to have some exciting programming coming up the rest of this week. Tomorrow we're going to have an all levels workout followed by an advanced full body workout. Then on Thursday we're going to talk about eating in the pandemic, and Friday we are going to have an fun and exciting Philosophy Friday. It's like wild card day.
Yeah, it's wild card philosophy, but email us if you've got ideas for discussions you'd like to have on Philosophy Friday, people you'd like to have on, topics you'd like to discuss. I'm sort of facilitating this week. I don't know where Jess and Maureen and Scott are going, but anyway, but let us know. So let us know if you've got topic ideas. Sorry, Jess, go ahead.
Nope, that's perfect. So, yeah, join us for those calls. You know, if you're not a member yet of the NFB, we welcome you and invite you to join us, and you can reach out to us. So I'll turn it over to Maureen.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So just a reminder, if you are having any issues related to COVID-19 in Colorado, or you would like to become a member of the National Federation of the Blind, or you have great ideas for us or any questions at all, please call and leave a message at 303-778-1130, extension 219, or email us at assistance@nfbco.org. That's assistance@nfbco.org. And we are so privileged again this evening to have the Blind History Lady with us. I know personally, I love reading the stories that Peggy has for us. They are so interesting. It is so cool to hear such vital parts of our history. And I feel like I have learned so much from reading everything that you put out, Peggy. So thank you so much. And I think all of us are looking forward to another evening of a fantastic story. So I don't know if Scott has anything. If not, we could turn it over to Peggy.
Yeah. Let's turn it over to Peggy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. Yes, if anyone is interested in getting on my email list and you're not already on my email list, you can contact me at theblindhistorylady@gmail.com. That's all one word, theblindhistorylady@gmail.com. And I will add you to my monthly emails.
Woo-hoo.
Each month I present a story about somebody that I found fascinating for one reason or another. This month in May, my story was about blind Bibles and how they ended up paving the way for Braille in our country, the Braille services that we have in our country, the American Printing House and so on, and listed the costs. And this article described exactly how the process worked. And they would heat up all this tin, and when it was hot, place it on, make this tinfoil mold, if you will, and print up these Braille pages. And just fascinating to read how some of the things were done for our blind folks in the past and what they started for us in the future. Today, because this is Colorado, today we're going to talk about some of the blind folks here in Colorado, and I chose newspapermen, partly because they all felt they were the one and only in the country, and they presented themselves as the one and only blind guy at some point in their careers. Now, Two of these people were actually members early on in what was known as the United Workers for the Blind that began meeting in 1913, although there was a group that kind of met a little on and off around 1900, but this was the first formalized, regularly scheduled, if you will. In 1915, our records start that we have in the basement at the Colorado Center for the Blind. Unfortunately, they're all in handwriting, which is extremely difficult for me to read. And so once we get them digitized, once we can get past this pandemic time and get the archivists there, we can get these digitized and hopefully find a bunch of folks who will transcribe them into formats that we can read, because then we'll find out more about some of these people that I talk about. And in 1917, the organization, the United Workers for the Blind, was incorporated. In these records, hopefully we can find out more about who the people were that made up the organization, and in particular, two of the gentlemen that I'm going to talk about tonight. The first one is going to be Lute Wilcox. Lute Wilcox is an interesting sort of fellow. He was self-educated. That's because Lute Wilcox was born in Pennsylvania in 1858. So the Civil War breaks out, and Pennsylvania is where fighting took place, battles took place, a lot of devastation in the area where he lived. So he didn't get to go to school. By the age of 12, he was already working for a newspaper, and he was doing the grunt jobs like hauling the ink and very heavy physical jobs for these young boys. And if they survived, they could, move up the ladder at the newspaper. A lot of them were injured, ink, things were spilt on them. They were injured by falling machinery, etc. He wasn't. So he moved on to several other papers. By the age of 14, he was on his own. He and his sister were living with another family, and he was supporting himself, working as a newspaper person. What he was doing at that time, whether he was a reporter, don't really know. He moved on to other newspapers in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And then in 1878, he got the itch to move to Colorado and came to Denver. And he became a newspaper reporter, correspondent for the Denver Tribune and then the Trinidad paper. And then he moved to New Mexico and started working for the Las Vegas Optic, which was a very new newspaper at the time. Now, Lute was born blind in one eye. What the condition was of his other eye is not really known. But by the time he got to New Mexico, he would sometimes mistake people. And at the time, the competing papers like to poke fun at each other, and they specifically like to poke fun at Lute. So they would mention these things, or that Lute went chasing out someone out of the newspaper office who he thought had taken his raincoat, and he was chasing them with a raincoat on that looked pretty much like his. Gee, Lute, da-da-da. So his eyesight was probably deteriorating. And in 1885, he left Las Vegas, New Mexico, and went back up to Denver, where he and a friend did the Denver Field and Farm magazine. His friend in a couple of years backed out, and Lute turned the business not only into just their magazine and printing their magazine. They didn't just put the magazine together, they did the printing of the magazine. He expanded the printing establishment. He had an advertising firm. He would print other magazines for different organizations and so on. By 1890, he was totally blind, and he married in 1890. He bought a house in Albuquerque, which was about 2,100 square feet. Now, today that's a nice size house, but you think 1890, that's a big house. It actually is still standing today, by the way. It's been remodeled considerably, of course, but this was a very large house for someone to have purchased. So back to what Lute did, we were joking a little bit before about fake news. Lute was a very interesting character. He was very well groomed. He was very good looking, and he liked to, he was considered a ladies' man. A couple of times there was hints that he was getting married to someone from this state or another state. He didn't get married from those states, but he was somebody who interviewed Billy the Kid, and he wrote about that in the Las Vegas Optic. That was a big deal. When Pat Garrett shot Billy the Kid, of course, this was big news, and the story goes that someone from the party that shot and buried Billy the Kid chopped off his trigger finger and sent it to the Las Vegas Optic, where it was kept in a jar of alcohol. They called it the Pickled Digit. If you were wanting to see this Pickled Digit, you would go into the Las Vegas Optic and pay for a year's subscription of the Las Vegas Optic, and then you could go see this finger in this jar. That raised the newspaper a lot of money and overtook the Gazette that was in town. Lute told a story in the newspaper of how Billy the Kid's sweetheart wrote to the newspaper wanting to know if she could have the finger because they were supposed to have gotten married, and they told her that they had just sold the finger. So this story was all played out in the newspaper. Now, the newspaper did not print the letter from the alleged lady friend of Billy the Kid. But the interesting thing about this is, even though the story is pretty much debunked, even though people are pretty sure that nobody cut off any body parts of Billy the Kid and sent them to anybody, not a single newspaper in New Mexico challenged it. And this is at a time when they would challenge each other all the time. The Las Vegas Gazette, anytime Lute made a mistake, a spelling error, or a factual error, the Gazette made a big deal out of it. If he got sick, they put that in the paper. It was the Las Vegas Gazette that reported that Lute Wilcox was part of the vigilante group that went down to the jailhouse one night. These guys had a key, so you got to figure the sheriff was in on it. But the jail was full, and they took the crooks out one by one and took them to a site and then started to hang them. And if they pled for their life good enough, they'd let them go and they'd chase them out of town, and then told the next one that they had hung the previous one and bring the next one out. And they evidently only had to hang one till he really started to beg as he was dying. They let every one of them go, and supposedly none of them died. But this was the type of man that Lute Wilcox was. He liked the sensational stuff. He liked to be a part of the party set. He liked to report on the interesting things that people were doing, and the best way to do that was to be their bosom buddies. He got into some mining organizations and held stock in some of the mining companies around New Mexico and Colorado. He started to purchase land and got really into agriculture. Now, this is a guy who's probably not doing a lot of reading, but he obviously has a very good memory because he's giving speeches from at least the early 1880s through the 1930s, and he's not using any sort of notes. He never learned to read any Braille that we can prove, or New York Point, as that was primarily taught in Colorado. So he gets married, and now he's lost all of his vision, and he has to come out as a blind guy. Before that, he did not come out as a blind guy, and he did his best not to show himself as clumsy. When he traveled, he usually traveled with another person. He didn't travel much by himself until after he went totally blind, which I find interesting. Then he often would take a train to a different part of Colorado. Evidently, he got his confidence or something after that, or was not so much ashamed of his blindness. He never wrote any articles about blind people. He never hung around with any blind people before the early 1900s that we know about. In 1900, the first indication that he dealt with any blind people was when someone from New York, the New York Institute for the Blind, reached out to him as a blind publisher and said, we've got these 4 guys here we'd like to send to Colorado, and you teach them the newspaper and printing business. And he did do that. He did help them get started in newspaper printing businesses, but we don't know who the names of these people are. It's just documented in the New York annual reports that thanks to Wilcox, 4 people who were trained by him for almost a year in Denver went off and became newspaper editors on their own. Lute Wilcox often said that he was the only blind editor as well. And I find that interesting because he did have so many connections with other newspapermen. He must have known about Joseph Pulitzer, who was pretty much blind, not being able to reprint by that time, and so on. That brings us to the other, I'm the only blind newspaper editor in the world gentleman, and his name is Frank Beeslin, or Beslin, depending on who you talk to in their family. And Frank was born in 1856, and he was also born in Pennsylvania, by the way. He got the urge to move west. They lived in several states, for Iowa for a while, and Nebraska, before he came to Colorado in the late 1870s and began mining. He was blinded in a mining accident and lost all of his vision. He went out, he had been a member of many civic organizations as well, and he went out to these civic organizations and asked them to help fund surgeries for him to get his eyesight back, excuse me. He did finally find a doctor who would operate on him. Most doctors said, you know, guy, I'm sorry you're blind. It's the way it is. But he found somebody who transplanted his eyes with chicken eyes. And you can imagine that he didn't get any eyesight back, but evidently he had to wear something over his eyes for the rest of his life because it just kind of grossed people out. So be careful when you're out there looking for a quack to do something for you. You might end up with a lot more than you bargained for. Anyway, so he's blinded, and after about 3 years, he's realizing he's not going to get his sight back, especially after the chicken operation. He builds his own house and settles down into the Aspen area and opens up the Enterprise. And that was not only just the newspaper there, but it became a printing firm. He printed other people's notices, magazines, flyers as well, but he also became a book printer in Aspen, and he did every job in the book printing plant, including the binding of the books as well. Most of his money, though, was made by public speaking. Everybody wanted to hear his story, and he evidently loved to play up the explosion and searching for the cure for his blindness and the chicken surgery and all that good stuff. He claimed that he was the only blind person to ever edit any kind of a newspaper in the world. That was one of the things that would go up on the notices when he would go from town to town speaking, and made himself out to be just this really excellent traveler. This is also at the same time, he's doing this from about 1883 to 1890 here in Colorado. And this is the time when Lute is up in Denver, and Lute is part of the Horticulture Society. Lute had lands and farming lands and had become an expert on a variety of different aspects of horticulture, including bees. He would speak, Lute would speak to all of these governmental agencies and such, and was printed up in the paper all the time. Now, Lute is not often referred to as the blind editor, where Frank was always the blind editor. So whether they knew about each other, it's hard to say. But in 1890, Frank goes up to Salt Lake and starts a newspaper up there. And he's there for several years before moving to South Dakota, where he starts another newspaper. By the time he's hitting South Dakota, though, the newspapers are starting to imply that maybe he's a little bit on the crazy side and so on. He died in South Dakota in 1915. He had nothing to do with the United Workers for the Blind that we know of. But the last time I talked on Colorado Talk, we talked about Jenny Cowan Jackson and how she had gone around the state finding all these blind guys. One of the gentlemen that she found was Charles Smith. He was one of the early names in our minutes that I could dig out. But, you know, try and track a Charles Smith when you don't know how old he is, what his occupation is. Is he living in Denver, or is he living in Grand Junction? You know, excuse me. I finally found the Charles Smith. He was in Colorado Springs, actually. And this Charles Smith was early on in the United Workers for the Blind. I don't know how long, and hopefully once we get our minutes transcribed, we'll have some idea of how long he actually took part in the organization. He served as a board member of the United Workers for the Blind, but what he did before that, when Jenny found him, when the home teacher found him, he had gone blind from being hit in the head with a baseball. And for about 6 months, he decided to feel sorry for himself, and then kicked himself in the backside and learned how to type. He became a fast typer. He actually worked very hard to become a fast typer, and then got himself in a secretarial administrative position for a bond company, stocks and bonds, not bail bondsman, but stock and bond company in Denver for a couple of years. Then he moved back to Colorado Springs, where he got a job with the Colorado Springs newspaper, although he was paid through AP, through the Associated Press Services. And what he did was, in the evenings, he would transcribe from the telegraph with his typewriter all the information that was coming off of the telegraph, and he would type as fast as they were sending, believe it or not. And he would then leave it. He got off work about 3:30 or 4 in the morning. He would leave it for the editors to put the paper together from what he typed. Now, this guy, he actually was in contests. AP had contests with their telegraph operators, how fast they could send and how fast they could receive. And he did pretty well in the sending, but with receiving, he often took top honors. And he's doing this with a typewriter. He's not doing this with a shorthand pad or anything like that. So he must have had an extreme speed in typing. When Jenny went to work with him, she taught him how to read New York Point and got him the Matilda Ziegler magazine. That was done in New York Point for several years. So he learned to actually be a very good reader and writer in New York Point. He said he could write faster in New York Point than he could read. When the Matilda Ziegler went to a Braille format, he told the media then that he wasn't going to learn to read all over again for the third time. So he was just going to read whatever there was in New York Point, which in the state of Colorado was very little. He did not put himself off as the only blind person working for a newspaper, but said that he was probably the only person working as a telegraph operator. He definitely was in the state of Colorado. There was a gentleman in Tennessee who was working for the railroads as a telegraph operator, communicating between railroad stops and so on. We didn't find too many of those. I haven't found too many of those yet. But these are the types of men that were in our state that had a high profile. Charles Smith and Lute Wilcox had definitely a high profile in the blind community. They got together and worked on legislation and so on. It looks like Smith kind of backed off, probably sometime in the mid-20s from the organization. That was a kind of a tumultuous time for the United Workers for the Blind, as they had gotten a lot of legislation passed through about 1918, and then in comes the AFB and another blind legislator, and just disassembled everything that had been done. So some of the blind folks kind of just walked away from they didn't want to be a part of all the fighting. Lute Wilcox, on the other hand, I told you he was a gentleman who was not beyond fabricating his stories. He not only did he fabricate they're pretty sure that he fabricated the trigger finger story, but he also fabricated other Billy the Kid stories, making them far more exciting than the story actually really was. He wrote, after he stopped being a part of editing a newspaper, he wrote many short stories, and several of them are actually up in a collection at the University of Colorado up in Fort Collins. I went up there to see the files that they do have, and he wrote several short stories. He wrote several short stories that were published in other magazines as well. When he was doing Field and Farm, especially through about 1900, 1905, he was often accused by other publications of stealing their stories, putting them in Field and Farm, and taking credit for it. Lute had money, and probably a lot of that from the mining stock that he must have held, maybe from his lands, but he had money. And so what he did is he started going around and buying up all these smaller farming magazines, horticulture magazines, animal husbandry magazines. And so by the time 1910 hits, he's got between 30 and 40,000 subscribers to his magazine, which is a lot of people. He becomes involved in the Denver Newspaper Association organization. He's president of that organization for a while, and he cleans up his act as far as his reputation is concerned. He's now giving people credit in his magazine when he takes on a story that he took from someplace else. Maybe he didn't pay them for it, but he gave credit for it. He's getting involved in the United Workers for the Blind. He brings to bear all of his news contacts with him to the organization, which is how they ended up having a lot of folks picking up stories around the state about blind people. So you've got from about 1916 to the 1920s, a lot of stories about blind people, a lot of stories about legislation, a lot of stories about the education of the blind, a lot of stories about um, the types of work that people are doing. The workers started the workshop for the blind. Lute didn't have a lot to do with the workshop for the blind, but he gave the press contacts that he had to Jenny, who did have a lot of contact with the workshop. And they did stories about the employees there, hoping to find better jobs for them and so on. The newspaper people treated blind people with a lot of respect from 1915 to about 1925 in Colorado. If you look back to about the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, you have a lot of disparaging words describing people, even when they're trying to build them up. Blind people who were walking along a sidewalk and fell, and they talk about the blind person as a respected member of the community, but being a blind person had no business walking on the street. The poor man had no business walking on the street. Now, they've already said he's a respectable person in the beginning of the article, and then talks about him as the poor man, or the desperate blind farmer, or there was a family who had a blind couple who had a disabled child and two other children, and the children were described as being hopelessly disadvantaged by their upbringing. The parents were described as the helpless parents, yet they had a farm. They were not on community support of any kind. After you've got Lute Wilcox becoming a part of the United Workers for the Blind people are now enterprising, energetic. Of course, they're always using the word amazing, but they're described as clever. They're described as business oriented. They're described with many words that are positive in the description. And then you get after about 1925, and this all starts to go back to the way it was in the 1880s. But I thought the last time I didn't give a lot of time for questions about the subject matter or our records that we have in the basement, and I would like to give a little bit of time for that. For those of you who don't know, we have records dating back to 1915 that are in various stages of disrepair. Some are very well preserved, some are not. We are almost ready to send them to a professional digitization firm that will OCR as much as they can, but we have many things written in handwriting that they're not going to be able to be OCR'd. We have many newspaper clippings that are written in old formats that are not going to be digitized well, as you're going to get O's for E's, and like TBO is the. I'm getting used to reading some of that kind of stuff now. But we also have things that are just damaged in darkened in such a way that they're just not going to be able to be scanned well. So we're going to have a good project after they are scanned for the next, hopefully only 3 years, to find people to help to digitize them and put them in a Word format or text format so that we can go into our own archives and search for like people like Charles Smith and dates that would take place that would be important to research legislation or maybe we want to search through the records to find out more about the pension bills and so on. And once we have that all done, we'll be able to digitize. So if folks are willing, I'd be glad to take questions.
If you're dialing in, you can hit *9 or on the JAWS computer Alt-Y, and on the app, it's under the More section if you want to raise your hand. All right. The phone number ending in 1892.
Hello, this is Debbie Brown from Maryland. At a time like now, there's some, there probably are people who can see that are, that don't have their regular work to do. Is this a thing we can find a way to get some board site links to transcribe?
If I had been 2 weeks ahead of this project, that would have happened because the archivist was going to be coming over the day Colorado kind of shut down, and to let me know what I needed to do to finish it up, or if I was ready to go. Yeah, I'm just thinking of all the time wasted here. Yes, and I think that if I can get this project digitized in the next maybe several weeks while we slowly open up here in Colorado, that when I'm pretty sure we are sort of going to be in a shelter in place a little more in the winter, we'll have a lot more people who may be interested in helping us, sighted people helping us to transcribe these documents. And I do have a few groups that may be interested in doing that. So we do have a place to start once we get them digitized, because we don't want to send the originals out. These are one-of-a-kind documents. I don't want them lost. And they are also, many of them, in such a condition that I'm afraid they wouldn't survive mailing back and forth. And I don't want them in somebody else's hands where they may get destroyed before we have a chance to digitize them.
If anybody else would like to ask Peggy any questions, raise your hand.
I just want to say that I always love our Blind History Lady stories, and I just appreciate your time, and I appreciate all the work that you've put into this project.
Well, thank you very much. Lute did a lot of printing for blindness stuff. He would print out flyers and things that were circulated around, that left around, and many of the members who around the state, Colorado was fortunate, thanks to what Jenny was doing, to have a network that, especially during the legislative sessions of 1916, 1918, were able to mobilize these people, and they did that through many of the printed stuff that Lute did in his print shop. He retired. Lute was born in 1958, and 1858. Thank you. And he he retired from his business in the late 1920s, and it was mostly Lute Wilcox's money that kept the organization going for several years. His personal money, as well as money that he raised through his contacts from the newspaper business, but through many other businesses as well. I've just run across information about another printer who was a friend of Lute Wilcox and was active in the organization until 1955, a sighted person. And we'll be approaching him, we have approached him with the initial letter asking him to help support our project, and also asking if he has any information what his grandfather had done with the organization and some of the members. Does he know Lute Wilcox? Were there any letters that his grandfather had? Does his grandfather have any publications from the United Workers for the Blind, or any of the correspondence, letters between any of the board members and himself that we could add to our collection as well? And hopefully that will be interesting enough for him to want to get involved in this as well.
No, that's very cool.
We have Stuart.
Yes, hey Peggy, this This is Stuart Probst.
Hey, Stuart.
Hey, listen, these archives, these records, so they're in print. That's what I wasn't sure about. They're actually a print record as opposed to Braille.
Most of them are in print. We have later, like from the 50s, and then later on, like in the 80s, we have some Braille material. The Braille material, if there was any, has probably been thrown out or whatever. When the organization, after Wilcox died, it would seem that the organization had some financial difficulty, and it may have been that Lute was paying for the rent on the office because they had to downsize. And I believe that we probably had things thrown out then. But also in Colorado, as I said, not a lot of people read Braille or New York Point. New York Point was what was taught by the home teacher for many years and so on. Not a lot read Braille. So the records were kept in a records book. We have them all, they're very well preserved. The records books are very well preserved from 1915 to about 1940. So those are all in print. Then we have no records that we have found yet from the early 40s till about 1955. We have a few letters, and we have a lot of information about a lawsuit between the United Workers for the Blind and the Colorado Industries for the Blind that took place for about 2 years. We have a lot of documentation on that. We have a lot of newspaper clippings from the early 1940s on. Some of them are in very pristine condition in a scrapbook that was preserved very well. And we're not taking those out of the scrapbook. We're going to have that digitized as a scrapbook. Then we had another scrapbook that was from the 40s to about 1956, 57, 58. That was not preserved well. Those are in terrible condition. Some of them just, they weren't even readable. And then we had some that were water damaged and ink faded through them that made them illegible and started mold and mildew and all that good stuff. We have handwritten material that were minutes from some of our chapters from the 50s.
Cool.
And some of that is, the handwriting is really bad. They were written by partials who obviously could have benefited from Braille. But what we have is about 10 to 12 volumes of Braille material that we will have someone then transcribe those from the Braille into a Word or a text document that we will then have a record of that as well. That is another step in our process. We have lots of steps in this. It's a regular staircase to heaven, this project.
Do we have any moon type? Some moon type.
I have not found any moon type yet, but I've been looking for it, I'll tell you.
We had some moon type still around at the Illinois Braille and Sight Saving School, as it was back then. Did we have any equipment? Do we have any of the like old Braille writers or anything?
There are a couple in the cabinets upstairs in the Colorado Center for the Blind. Most of that, I believe, has already been taken out of whatever archives we've had. They don't, in my memory of looking at the cabinets, we don't have a lot that goes back really super far, but we do have the original seal of the United Workers for the Blind, which Julie Hunter and I tried to operate, and it's pretty solid state right now. It's going to take a little work to get it to work again, but I think we can do that. That's not a priority on the list, of course, but we did find that going through the boxes. And one of the things we're hoping to find are more photographs. We found one of the original brochures. If some of you remember from one of my other presentations, I talked about how we had the United Workers for the Blind from about 1913 to 1955. We had the Colorado Federation of the Blind from 1955 to 1972 or 3, whenever we changed over to the National Federation of the Blind. And then we had the Denver Area Association of the Blind, which is actually technically the extension of the United Workers for the Blind. Some lawyer explained to the Colorado Federation that we had to put up proper notice in the newspapers and whatever. And so in the documents, the United Workers for the Blind changed its name to the Denver Area Association of the Blind. This is because of wills and bequests that the organization was getting on an ongoing basis and had been since the early 1950s and maybe even before, and continued to receive until the late 1960s. So financially, they had to have something go on from the United Workers for the Blind and chose it to be the Denver Area Association. The Colorado Federation was then the official affiliate. The United Workers for the Blind was the official affiliate, but was reorganized into the Colorado Federation of the Blind, which, kind of a little messy, but once you start to figure out the paperwork, it works out.
Great stuff. Great stuff. Jessica and I and Kevin, we got to see a whale of a Braille writer collection one time in Albuquerque. I remember that was
Oh, yeah.
yeah, pretty exciting stuff right there.
There's some at the National Center for the Blind as well. There's some very old equipment there. And I know that the Minnesota affiliate at one time had some. I don't know if we still kept some of that stuff or not. That were the old slates where you wrote on paper. This predates the memo slate.
Yeah.
But it was just this really thin strip of paper, and it would go on and on and on forever.
I remember those. I remember those. I remember all kinds of gadgets. And I got some pretty old equipment myself. So, Peggy, I don't think we have any more questions, do we, Kevin?
I don't think so. Thank you so much. This was a great Blind History Lady story time.
And I want to remind folks that if you have articles for the upcoming Blind Colorado blog, please get them to me by tomorrow, close of business. And I hope we can have Peg back again. And thanks everybody for tuning in for another Mountain Time at 5. Thanks, Peggy.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
As far as the mid-80s.